Why did Americans use condoms on their 1016? Believe it or not, this was a reality, which in fact we have seen in quite a few movies, but not exactly as Hollywood painted it for us. To answer this question, we have to travel quite far back in time to the Vietnam War, particularly to 1966, where the Americans had been fighting for months against the Viet Cong with their 1014 automatic rifles. The 1014s were having quite a few problems adapting to the jungle. Actually, the 1014 had no reliability issues. Obviously, like any weapon, society gave it problems, but it wasn't particularly bad in this sense. Its problem was basically the low firepower it provided. The 1014 was the predecessor of the 1001 Garand, and it was basically the same weapon as its predecessor, only with a fire selector to shoot in automatic mode, and a 20-round magazine. This was done so that the weapon would have characteristics of a light machine gun and an assault rifle. The problem is that when using the 7.62x51 NATO, it had a terrible recoil when firing in automatic mode, so it was not useful as an assault rifle. So the soldiers used it in semi-automatic mode, as if it were a battle rifle, exactly like the M1 Garand. The Americans were having a lot of problems with the Viet Cong, as they had AKM and AK-47 weapons that seemed to have been born for the jungle. They had almost no reliability problems, in addition to being able to fire in automatic mode without much recoil. In '66, the United States buys 850,000 Colt 1016 rifles to replace the United States 1014, and of course to supply its allies. The 1016 delivered a firepower similar to that of the AK-1000 and AK-47, in addition to being a much better balanced weapon. American soldiers were happy to get a replacement for their 1014, which, while the 1014 were not bad, they were not functioning well as a standard rifle for the Army. In the first weeks of using the 1016, soldiers began to report failures with their rifles. They had considerable reliability issues. The 1016s were much more prone to jamming due to dirt and mud. In addition, the barrels could corrode with water. The 1016s practically had to avoid any kind of moisture because the mechanisms in the barrel would corrode easily. Can you imagine being in a jungle combat where it could rain for up to 7 days in a row and your weapon couldn't get wet? This must have been a big headache for the American soldiers. Really, all these problems were solved with constant maintenance. The problem is that when the first versions of the 1016 arrived, the manufacturer, that is Colt, did not deliver cleaning kits because according to them it was not necessary. So the soldiers had to be cleaning their 1016 with nothing more and nothing less than toothbrushes. And obviously, if they didn't deliver cleaning kits, they trained the soldiers to clean them even less. And this was a somewhat complex weapon to assemble and disassemble. The worst part was the response to the complaints that the High Command gave to the poor soldiers. The solution, according to the High Command, was that if your weapon jammed, you should leave it and ask your partner for theirs. And in the case that the secondary could not be used, that is the pistol. All these problems were really not the fault of Colt, but of the Pentagon that modified the design of the AR-15 to make it, according to them, more acceptable to the Army. But all they did was ruin a good weapon. Knowing the context, we can guess why American soldiers used condoms on the barrels of their 1016s. The condoms were strong and waterproof, so they were perfect for putting on the mouth of the barrels to prevent water from entering the mouth of the barrel that could spoil it. It was also very common in Vietnam for the barrel to get clogged with mud or just dirt by accident, which was a problem in itself because if the soldier fired such a dirty weapon, it could damage the barrel, or worse, the barrel could explode and injure the soldier himself. Obviously, the condom didn't make the weapon submersible, but it solved the problem of humidity. The good thing is that if a soldier saw an enemy, he could perfectly shoot without any problems, as the shot would simply break the condom and that's it. And they just had to put one on again, sometimes they even reused it. The most common thing was to see soldiers putting tape on their barrels, but the funny thing is that the most common thing was that the soldiers did not have tape at hand. The most common thing was to have condoms, as the Army handed out medical kits with these. This practice was not really widespread, or at least not as Hollywood painted it. They were really things that some clever soldiers did to solve the problem of dirt. And in fact, this practice is much older than you think. In fact, this practice was created during World War II. The rains in France and Germany were a big problem for the Allied weapons. That's why the Americans came up with this concept, but again, it wasn't a very widespread practice, which is why almost no one knows about it. In fact, something very curious is that the condom was not only used on weapons, but also as a bag to carry objects that should not get wet. In addition to things like bandages or similar, something very common to carry in condoms were lighters. No matter how hard the manufacturers tried to make them waterproof, they always ended up failing. The condoms protected them well from water, and they even put in wicks and even detonators for explosives to prevent them from getting wet. Also, in cases of extreme survival, there have been cases where pilots who injected themselves in the jungle used condoms as a canteen, of course, to carry water. The soldiers lived this situation until 1968. In this year, they changed the M16 Rifles for a modernized version called M16, which solved almost all the reliability problems, so it was almost 2.5 years of suffering. Without a doubt, the condom saved the lives of many soldiers, both from ladies with diseases and from the harsh Vietnamese climate.